I'll use this lecture to talk about service learning and marine debris. I know service learning is looking a little bit different right now, but overall, we'll go over what service learning opportunities we are kind of hoping for and what the reasons are for these service learnings. So for service learning, ideally, right, we want to be able to get out in nature, discover your community, give back to your community. But the main takeaway I want you guys, especially for this semester, is to be able to relate biological concepts to different service learning opportunities. Even if we're not able to get out in nature, you might have to use your imagination a little bit, or you might be able to get out just by yourself. But relate the things that you're learning both in this lecture and in your experiences over the semester to different biological concepts that you'll learn. And this is kind of something that you'll write about in your Kuleana paper at the very end of the semester that serves as sort of a reflection paper. Okay. And another reason for service learning, you know that we're trying to incorporate more Ike Hawaii into this um, course. We're also trying to incorporate more Nohona Hawaii and more Aina-based learning. So Aina-based learning is kind of the same as place-based learning, right? And ideally, we want you guys to be in places learning about things that are relevant culturally, scientifically, and relevant to where you live, right? So a lot of our service learning does focus more so in like the Eva region, since most of you guys tend to be on that side of the island, but we can always talk about stuff that's occurring all over the island as well. So since we're going to be focused on virtual service learning this semester, we do have a few things lined up, and then some of it is obviously subject to change, but our first one is going to be using traditional ecological knowledge to observe the natural environment. We're also going to be talking a little bit, probably in that lecture, about native, endemic, endangered, and invasive species, what the differences are, why they're important. I'll touch on that a little bit in this lecture as well. Hopefully, we will also have a la'au workshop, which is traditional Hawaiian use of plants. I think it's actually going to be more so la'au lapa'au, so medicinal use of plants, and probably focus pretty heavily on plants that you can find in Hawaii. Um, Hopefully also we will have some sort of fish pond and or lo'i restoration or service days, focusing on Malama i Ka'aina. Again, it depends on whether stuff starts opening up a little bit more. Maybe we'll have someone talk about this if we're not able to do it. Might also have you guys do a beach cleanup, even if it's solo or with your family. But the whole idea is that this service learning is bringing culture, language, and science all together to relate it to what you're learning about this semester. So one of the first things we're going to be talking about is using traditional ecological knowledge, commonly referred to as TEK, or you might hear it as tech. Um, it's indigenous knowledge or native science, right? So we have this Hawaiian proverb here, which I'm very sorry if I butcher it. I will try not to, but ikava ma mua, ikava ma hope, which just means in the time in front, in the time in back. So it's telling us that the future is behind us, which means that we can learn from everything that we've already experienced, right? So wisdom from the past is what's before us. And that's essentially what we want to be using with traditional ecological knowledge. We already have all this knowledge from our ancestors, from our kapuna, from even ourselves, right? We've lived lives, depending on how old you are, from anywhere from like 18 to I don't know, 60 plus years, right? So that evolving knowledge is something that you can use to figure out the answer to questions or use when you're observing the natural world. So traditional ecological knowledge is just the evolving knowledge acquired by indigenous and local people over hundreds or thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. Obviously, a lot of our ancestors and a lot of indigenous people are pretty heavily involved with the environment, right? They didn't have the technology that we currently have that really takes us away from being in direct contact with nature or the environment. So they have a lot more knowledge than we do in a lot of respects, because it's so specific to what their experiences are. Usually it's really specific to a location. It includes relationships between plants, animals, natural phenomena, landscapes, timing of events. You can use it for lifeways, including hunting, fishing, trapping, agriculture, forestry. These are all things that you can use indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge to sort of further explain research or even just as a way of living, right? We can use ancient ways, or not even super ancient, but some of these things like the way that you, let's say, go fishing might be a way that your grandpa taught you, whose grandpa taught him. And it's something that you just continue to do over generations and generations, and it works, right? And it works probably based on some proverb or story that you've heard before, but all of it is actually usually pretty science-based. And so this is a very different approach than Western science, which is mostly what this class is. And we're trying to kind of bring together the two, Indigenous and Western science, because they work really well together. Even if people don't want to believe that, they do. And we're starting to see it more and more. And luckily, there's been a little bit of a push and a little bit of revival of Indigenous wisdom, and I'm hoping that you guys can take away that from this class and take it into your lives and other subjects as well. So I'm going to talk about a few places that are on the EVA side that we will probably not get to experience too much. You might hear some guest speakers talk about it, but this is what we would normally try to do if we were able to meet in person for these things. So one of the places is in Kalaeloa. It's the Pearl Harbor National Wildlife Refuge. It's run by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and it's actually split into 3 units. We normally would go to the Kalaeloa unit, which again is in Kalaeloa. It's like in the very back, kind of, if you know where that paintball place is. It's right along the coast, right next to the airport back there. Um, and it was established during a military base closure proceedings in 2001. And the main reason why they established this unit is to protect native plants. So that's pretty awesome. We have this whole set of landscape or of area that's dedicated solely to protecting native plants. It's not huge. I forget exactly how big it is, but it is a decent sized area, and it's ironic because it's in between the airport and like a bunch of other sort of industrial complexes and refineries. So it's in kind of a weird space, but it's really neat to be able to go there and be able to see this restoration of native plants and species taking place. So Kalaeloa, some of you probably live here. If not, you're probably at least a little bit familiar with it or pass it. It's essentially where West Oahu is, but we're on the Ewa Plain. Ewa Plain is pretty unique. So it's very, very dry. Most of it is made up of limestone. It's actually all an old raised coral reef. And so because of this, Kalaeloa actually contains the last remaining ancient coastal dry shrubland plant communities. So there's quite a few native plants that do really, really well in Kalaeloa, and it's because it's such a dry place. So the native plants that do well there are the ones that are pretty resistant to drought and things like that. But it has been sort of a good place to do a lot of these restoration projects because it's so unique, right? So we have a dry area, old raised coral reef, everything underneath is limestone. So this Kalaeloa unit of the Pearl Harbor National Wildlife Refuge, again, was to protect native plants. So we have Ewa hina hina, we have a koko, we also have Maiapilo and Nio. Nio is a pretty cool native plant, and it's one of the most predominant at this refuge, because it's really a strong competitor against a lot of alien grasses. Okay, so alien means the same thing as invasive. Sorry, you guys know I'm not very good with writing. So we'll talk a little bit about native versus invasive species right now so that you can kind of get a good idea about what they are. And it's probably just like what it sounds like, right? So native species are ones that got here naturally. They might not have been born with the Hawaiian Islands, right? Our Hawaiian Islands were born in a pretty unique way compared to a lot of different places. We were formed from volcanoes, so there's not a lot of things that were here initially. They got here by wind or currents, however, but they came here naturally versus invasive is a species, no matter what it is, if it's plant, fish, um, I'm trying to think, mongoose, whatever it is, right, that were brought here by non-natural means. So they were here on ships or planes, humans brought them, whatever whatever method that took, but we have native versus invasive. So why do we fight for our natives and fight against invasives? Well, natives, like I said, are here naturally, so we want to protect them. They're something that our ecosystem was basically built on and is based on, and it's what keeps our ecosystem nice and healthy. And invasives have kind of the opposite reaction. So invasives, the bad thing about them, and again, there are aliens, right? Ooh, this is rough. Um, these guys are really good at outcompeting our native species. Outcompetitive, outcompeting. Let's put that. Yeah, okay. So these guys outcompete all of our native species. The way that they outcompete these native species is, let's say, for example, plants. So let's say we've got a native Hawaiian plant, and it's just this little bush right here. I know it's a great drawing. A lot of native Hawaiian plants aren't very tall and big. A lot of them tend to be kind of bush-like you can see the Eva hina hina up here, the koko. Um, and native Hawaiian plants also tend to have kind of like a silvery leaf color to them. Obviously greenish still, but you can kind of see like a silver tint to a lot of them. So keep that in mind if you're looking for native plants, or if you're ever doing any sort of refuge or restoration project and you're pulling invasive species, don't ever pull the native ones. They are very likely endangered, which means that there's not very many of them left, right? So that's one of the reasons why we're fighting so hard to protect them. But we have our native plant down here, whether it's a tree or a bush. Usually they don't grow very tall, whereas a lot of invasives that we see do grow to be pretty tall. I know this is very sophisticated drawing, but let's say this is some invasive tree. Um, so what kind of things do plants need, right? What kind of resources do they need? Well, we know they need lots of nutrients. They need food, they need water. The other big thing that plants need is sun, right? So if we have this big invasive guy here, he's actually shading our little native one, and he gets all of this nice sunlight going directly onto him. He shades this guy out. This guy can't get any of the nutrients that he needs and eventually dies off. And then these guys keep reproducing and growing more and more invasive trees or bushes or plants, whatever they are, outcompeting our whole native ecosystem. So invasive species do that all the time. We have that in the marine world. We have that with fish. We have lots of invasive species that are really good at outcompeting our natives in terms of they're able to catch prey a little bit easier. We also have, let's say, feral cats. Feral cats are an invasive species. They eat a lot of our endangered and native seabirds, for instance, like our albatross, or albatross eggs. They also produce a toxin in their, I believe it's their urine, or fecal matter. It might be both. But they produce toxins that have actually killed off quite a few of our monk seal population, which, if you remember from our lab, our monk seal population is also endangered, and they are native to our islands as well. So this is one of the big reasons why we're always fighting for natives and we're trying to combat invasives, whether it's pulling them from the ground or taking different biological measures to try to eliminate them or lessen them so that our natives can really thrive. So these Nio trees are actually really, really good competitors against a lot of those invasive grasses. So they can kind of outcompete them, which is one of the big reasons why we want them around, because when you have a native that can outcompete aliens, that's awesome, right? And at the Kalaeloa Refuge, they are predominantly Nio trees, but the problem is we have these things called Nio thrips, and they are taking over and infesting our Nios. This is what infested looks like versus healthy. And unfortunately, it's been going slowly island to island and kind of taking over big populations of our Nios. So it's a reason why if you do go to this refuge, you have to follow pretty strict quarantine protocols, but they are decimating Nile populations and quickly spreading to all the islands. They actually just recently, last semester, found some thrips in this refuge. So they haven't been allowing anyone that doesn't work for Fish and Wildlife to go in and work because of it. So that's another reason, like if you go hiking and you see the little things to scrape off your shoes before you go hike, please do those kinds of things. Try not to track soil or dirt or anything like that around different parts of the island because we do have invasive, invasive plants. You could be having seeds on your hiking boots or your clothes, whatever it might be, or it could be a pest that you're carrying around. All of these things are terrible. And if you're carrying it from one part of the island, that's bad enough. But especially if you're going island to island, or if you're coming back from mainland or some other country and bringing it to here, that's how we get a lot of these invasive species that just totally take out our native populations. The other cool thing at Kalaeloa are these anchialine pools. So they're a landlocked body of water with a subterranean connection to the ocean. So there's a mixture of salt and fresh water. They were artificially created at Kalaeloa. They did have them before, but this became a military base, and I forget exactly why, but they excavated them out to see if the shrimp would show back up, and they did, which is pretty cool. So the shrimp that live in these little pools are endemic to Hawaii, which means that they are only found here. So endemic means that it's only found in that location. So endemic to Hawaii means they're only found in the Hawaiian Islands, nowhere else in the world. So that's really special for a few reasons, right? It's a native species, it's only found here, but it also means that we really have to protect them because if they go missing from here, if they go extinct, if they're endangered, that means that there's no other populations in the world that can help bring them up. So once they're gone, they're gone. So these little guys, you might have heard of them or seen them around. They're called opaiula, and they range anywhere from like a clearish tint with maybe a little bit of pink to pretty red. I usually think of them as pretty red. And you can see them, especially in these anchialine pools here, you just see like mats of red, and they're just hundreds and thousands of these little shrimp. So they're pretty cool. They are pretty small. They tend to be about 1.5 centimeters. Um, we used to have 600 to 700 ponds around, I think that's just around Oahu, but it might be around the whole Hawaiian Islands. And we have far, far less now. So these are much harder to find now. They've been filled in, or different things have happened to them where these shrimp are, I don't think they're endangered just because they can produce so quickly and they can thrive so easily. But this is another endemic species, a native species that's pretty cool to find at this place. So one of the other biological concepts that we'll talk about, especially related to this place and some other things, right? And this is kind of just to get your mind thinking about how climate change can affect different parts of our island or maybe different refuges where we have something like this like restoration work going on, um, is basically the people who are doing these projects or developing anything on island especially have to really start thinking ahead because of climate change. So there's a few things happening. One of the big ones that's going to really hit our island hard is sea level rise, right? Even a little bit of sea level rise is going to impact quite a bit of our infrastructure, our economy, um, all of that stuff. So we really have to start thinking ahead, and they're already doing this at places like Kalaeloa, because they know that the sea level rise is expected to be pretty great in the next 10 years. So they've started planting natives further inland. They're not really planting them along the coast because they know that those are going to be wiped out eventually. So they want to start building a really healthy forest community up a little bit so that they're not immediately taken out by something like by sea level rise or maybe a big storm or something like that. The anchialine pools are also probably going to be taken over once that happens. They're going to just be filled in and they'll become basically an underwater cave in the sea. But these are probably able to recover well. There's like a whole connection of anchialine pools, and they're trying to do some research now, but they think that the shrimp kind of somehow move around to different pools anyways. They're not sure if they're doing that through subterranean connections or what, but that would likely be how they're doing it. So they think that these little opaiula are pretty good survivors, but it'll be interesting to see how that changes with climate change in the future. One of the other places that we like to go is Kalaeloa Heritage Park. The main guy there, his name is Uncle Shad, and he really likes to talk. So if you ever meet him, he will talk your ear off. And he is a great guy to talk about any sort of cultural references at this place. He knows the backstory. He's from this place. He's been there for a very long time, and so has his family. And Kailua Heritage Park, I'm sorry, has very similar fauna to what you would see just down the road at the refuge. And again, they're doing a lot of native outplanting and pulling different invasives, but we've got far more cultural references here. So maybe we can get him to do a talk story with us over Zoom one day, but I'm not sure if we can make that happen or how long that could possibly go. Okay, so that's a little bit about some of the service learning. We will also be hopefully talking about traditional uses for plants, whether it's medicinal like la'al lapa'al, or different things like that, so that hopefully you can get a little bit of experience with just trying to connect with nature and get a little bit of that cultural significance as well. We're going to also go into something that's very near and dear to my heart is marine debris, which we'll talk about right now. It has to do a lot with plastic pollution, obviously, and then we'll end with bioerosion. So I was actually part of a marine debris cleanup in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands for basically a few months a couple of years ago. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of the photos from that project and kind of the things that we see and how we can change it, hopefully. So you guys have probably all heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's essentially right up here, right? And it happens because it's in between these gyres, and it's basically a bunch of trash accumulating because of the way that our currents go. So you can see we're down here, and here's our northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So the big garbage patch is a little bit north of us, but our northwestern is like a sifter for all of that junk. So we don't quite get as much trash down here in our main Hawaiian Islands as these guys do because everything is just coming down and circulating, and these guys are kind of sifting through a lot of the trash, unfortunately. And then we get some of the residuals, we get stuff that we get stuff coming from different places, but a lot of it hits our northwestern Hawaiian Islands first. Why is that a bad thing? So this is one of the photos. I'm on this boat actually, and we're heading to our ship where we kind of base all of our operations out of. But the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are super important culturally as well as biologically. Okay, so you can see there's lots of really nice, healthy reefs there. They're mostly low-level atolls that are surrounding all these places, and they have a lot of biodiversity, so lots of different species in a certain area. They have a lot of abundance, lots of different individuals of that species. They also have quite a few endemic and native species and lots that are still being discovered. So you can see this is a drone photo of us. We found a net that's right here on the reef, and basically one of the biggest problems we have is with something called derelict fishing gear. So I'll abbreviate it DFG, derelict fishing gear. And they're basically nets from people fishing, usually big commercial lines, and these can be huge and weigh thousands of pounds. And they essentially tumble over our reefs and kill different species, which we'll go over in just a second. But you can see how beautiful these reefs are. Lots of different barrier reefs in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, some of them surrounding different atolls that are in the islands. This is one that is off Midway, I believe. But these are what the atolls there look like. So they're very low level. They can be taken out very quickly by storms or hurricanes, tsunamis, anything like that. So this is what most of them look like, which means that trash collecting on them is super easy, right? It just rolls right up onto shore and it acts as like a big garbage bin. Okay. There are going to be lots of photos through this, so just bear with me. A lot of them I'll go through pretty quickly, but you guys can always look at them later if you want. So what is marine debris? What are we talking about? Marine debris is anything not natural, right? So we might look at this beach and be like, wow, there's a bunch of junk on it. But it's not junk, it's all natural, right? This isn't marine debris. Also not marine debris. This is marine debris. And I know you guys aren't little kids. I know that you know that this is probably debris or trash, but plastic bags are a problem. Luckily, we have mostly gotten rid of them here in the islands, but they're something that's super easy, right? You just get a reusable bag and you don't have to use anymore. But a lot of times, turtles will mistake these for jellyfish. You also have them being broken up into really tiny pieces sometimes, but they don't really degrade. Plastic um, takes forever to degrade, and by forever I mean hundreds of years. So it's kind of wild to think. I always like thinking about this. Every piece of plastic you've ever used in your lifetime, even probably every piece of plastic that your parents and your grandparents have ever used in their lifetime, all of that still exists on this earth. None of it is gone. It might have been burned, which we're then burning whatever those plastics are made out of, which is mostly refined fossil fuels, right? Or it could be degraded into microplastics. It could have been reused or recycled, but all of that plastic that you've ever used still exists. It's not gone. And that to me is really wild to think of because we all use a lot of plastic, even if we're trying to be conscious not to. It's hard to get rid of plastic because it doesn't go away. It's a cheap solution, and we've been using it pretty heavily in the last 50 plus years since we discovered it. So plastic water bottles, you guys have probably seen this picture, which a lot of it's natural marine debris, but you can see lots of like plastic bottles and wrappers and different things that are in this wave that this guy's surfing as well. So here's some pictures from our cleanup and just some of the most common things we find. Keep in mind that when we do this cleanup, other than bottle caps, we don't pick up anything smaller than the palm of our hand. And it's not because we don't want to, we do, but we're only up there for a certain amount of time. It costs a lot of money to get up there. And we just don't have time to pick up all those little tiny microplastics, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is a collection. You can see there's lighters here. These are all kinds of different bottle caps. And then we've got some, I think these are toothbrushes, and there's all sorts of different things over there. Shoes we also pretty commonly find. Lots and lots of shoes. Different toys, most of them, again, plastic. Lots of different toys. Um, More toys and kind of random things. You can see like a light bulb here, a plastic horse toy. This is pretty crazy. Do you guys see where this is from? This is from London. So again, these aren't necessarily, I would say 80 to 90% of the trash that's here is not from the Hawaiian Islands. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing a good job, or it doesn't mean that we're doing a good job here. It doesn't mean that we're not producing this amount of trash. It means that our trash is going somewhere else in the world. So they're getting stuff from Hawaii and from the US and being like, oh my gosh, look at all this crap coming from the United States, right? But a ton of stuff. These are like lots of fishing buoys, a tire. You find pretty crazy things up here, and you can find these things in the main Hawaiian Islands too, as well as if you went to California, any other coastal place, right? But it can move around the world pretty easily. Like we get things from London, and that's London is pretty crazy. We tend to find a lot of different things from Asia, especially like Japan after that Japan tsunami, remember? Um, all the things that were washing up here that we were a little nervous about being radioactive, but we get stuff from all over the world. And more toys, water bottles. And with that last water bottle, sorry, I moved kind of quickly, but you could see that part of it was missing. And part of it might be missing because it degraded, but it could also be missing because something else ate it. Okay. Tons of toothbrushes. If you do have the ability, bamboo toothbrushes are a great way to prevent this much plastic. Because these guys really never go away. These are all lighters here. These are different fishing. So we have eel cones down here. All of these are used for fishing essentially. All of these little tubes, and we find thousands of them everywhere. And again, one of our big problems, one of the biggest things that we're looking for on these trips are these derelict fishing gear. And they're huge. And they're usually a big conglomeration of different nets that have either connected in the ocean or they've fallen off from a vessel or something weird happened that they collected. But all of this marine debris is plastic, right? Which means, again, that it takes forever to degrade and it pretty much doesn't go away. So how does it get into our oceans? It's not just us throwing it in the ocean, right? We do see people do that, and Hopefully we yell at them, but it's not the most common way that these things fall into our oceans. It's because we're producing it. And say even on this island, we went over H power and our um, landfills. So those kind of things, H power, we can burn stuff, right? And that has its good and bad. Good because it's gone, bad because I'm sure it's not great to be burning plastic. I think that's probably putting lots of harmful things into the environment. But our landfills eventually, with sea level rise, with everything going on, a lot of it leaks into the ocean, whether we want it to or not, right? So what happens to all this plastic once it actually gets into the ocean? And it can come through, again, landfills, waterways, people littering. Everything eventually leads to the ocean, especially when you're on a small island like ours. So what is this an example of? This probably isn't naturally grading like that. It's probably getting eaten by something like fish, right? So you have these plastic pieces here. Depending on how big they are, if they're bigger, they attract bigger things. If they're smaller, they attract smaller things. A lot of them are kind of microplastics, which you've heard me say a few times, and that just means other plastics that have degraded into really tiny pieces like this, right? So these are our microplastics, and they attract really, really tiny things called plankton or larval fish, right? And then these guys eat it, and that was one of the articles that you guys recently read was them finding plastics in these larval fish. Well, who eats our plankton and our larval fish? The small fish do. Who eats the small fish? The big fish. And then who eats the big fish? Us, right? Um, and then we have other things like turtles, we have monk seals, all of this stuff is a problem for them as well, but we're working our way through the food chain with us being eating these plastic pieces that have been digested by different levels in the chain. So, how is it affecting wildlife? Like I said, a lot of this plastic, almost all plastic is floating, and it does look like food. So albatross is one of the big things that you'll see in albatross are a lot of these lighters, because from up above, these lighters look just like little fish on the top of the surface. So albatross often go down, they eat it. They're super, almost all wildlife, especially birds. And it's not because they're stupid, right? They're attracted to really bright colored things. They're attracted to things that are different. All of us are attracted to things that are different, right? You have to go check it out. It's part of like our scientific method is you go check it out. And with a lot of these animals, unfortunately, part of it is also consuming it, right? So you can't keep them away. They keep coming, and a lot of times they really can't avoid it very well. You can see these guys, our juvenile albatross, are just surrounded by trash. You can see how much trash they have to deal with. And this is an example of a dead bird, probably fairly recently. It's pretty decomposed, but look at how much stuff is in its stomach. Tons and tons of trash, tons of plastic, and it might not be the full reason that these birds die, but it definitely takes a toll on them, and eventually they're not going to be able to digest this stuff. A lot of times what happens is their stomach is so full of plastic that they think that they're full. So they're not really inclined to eat, and they end up actually starving to death because they're not getting any sort of nutrients that they need, and they think they're full, essentially full of plastic. It's a pretty famous picture of an albatross, and the photographer took out everything from its stomach and laid it out all nice and pretty here, and you can see how much plastic it consumed in its lifetime. Because again, they don't really pass that stuff usually. That stuff lingers in them. Um, and again, we don't know for sure how this bird died. I'm sure they did a little bit of an autopsy, but you never fully know. I can say with some confidence, probably had a lot to do with all this plastic they consumed. Probably died from starvation. And again, other animals, so turtles. Turtles are also pretty curious, especially a lot of them are eating jellyfish, so plastic bags are really attractive to them. You also see fishing hooks caught in turtles quite a bit. They also get attracted to these nets. So these derelict fishing gear, these nets that we find, most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, a lot of them float. And as anything floating in the ocean, it attracts lots of different animals for different reasons, right? So it attracts a lot of plankton and larval fish because it's what gives them kind of a shelter to hide from other big predators, like other big fish. Sometimes it attracts big charismatic megafauna, which is something like a turtle or a seal. Um, Something that maybe these guys can actually rest on. Could also attract sharks because they know that other smaller things are going to be resting there or they're going to be sheltering there, whatever it might be. These things really do attract animals, and again, their curiosity can kill them because they get really attracted and then sometimes they get entangled or other things happen as well. So we've come across quite a few of these, and luckily we've gotten to free a lot. We've found some that are dead and we've gotten to free a lot, but you think about how many were there that we weren't there for. We were there for 2 months out of the year. We try to go every year. So the other 10 months out of the year, they're just on their own, right? And all of this garbage is still there. It's not something that only happens when humans happen to go up there. So this is something that's a really common problem and it's not good. So again, you can see more turtles entangled in nets. Same thing happens with sharks. We find sharks in nets. We find little invertebrates, which we'll talk about what invertebrates are later in the semester, but little invertebrates like crabs, urchins, even smaller fish entangled in nets. Some of them die, some of them we can free, but again, only with what we're finding. One of the biggest problems in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands with these derelict fishing gear nets, all these nets that have been um, misplaced or dropped in the ocean for whatever reason, are also entangling a lot of our monk seals. Monk seals are super curious, just like any other seal. They come super close to these guys. They even like laying on top of them to get a little bit of rest. You can see how much they like it. And they also get entangled quite a bit. And since we only have like around 1,400 of these guys, they're endemic to Hawaii. They exist nowhere else on the earth. They're one of our most endangered mammals in the entire world. So these guys really, we've put a big push and a lot of money into protecting them as much as we can, but it's hard to do it when we have all this trash floating around that's just so easily entangling them. One of the other things we'll talk about really quick with these guys is something called ghost fishing. It doesn't really have to do with this picture as much, but ghost fishing happens with this derelict fishing gear, right? And it basically is just like it sounds. So you're actively fishing when you throw a net into the ocean, right? Especially these big boats that have these huge nets. They're actively fishing for something, whether it's tuna or, whatever kind of species they're looking for. They're fishing. But say this gets cut off their boat either by themselves or by accident, however it happens, once this gets into the ocean, it doesn't stop fishing. That's what we refer to as ghost fishing. So all of those pictures you just saw where they're entangling turtles, sharks, fish, invertebrates, monk seals, all of that is called ghost fishing because those aren't what we're necessarily meaning to fish for, but because those nets are in the ocean, a lot of times there's different hooks and stuff associated with them as well. They're still fishing, they're still killing these animals, but we're not getting anything from it, right? No one else is being able to eat it. It's just a completely useless killing through ghost fishing that's happening with this derelict fishing gear. The other thing that happens with these nets is we will find them on the coral reef. And you guys can see what's this part right here. It's super white, right? Coral also has these little things called zooxanthellae, and they photosynthesize, which we haven't talked about yet, but we need photosynthesis. We need it for our autotrophs, our first level of the food chain, our producers that can produce all the food for everything else in the food chain, right? And you guys might have heard of something called coral bleaching. It happens for a few different reasons, but basically these nets get onto the reef and they suffocate them. So we end up with bleached or dead reefs. Sometimes we get lots of different algae growing on it because of it, depending on what area it's in and what's happening with the net, how long it's been there. But this is something that's also really bad, obviously, for the reef. If the reef dies, that is one of our primary consumers. It also means that the reef ecosystem, so like our fish, our invertebrates, everything that's attracted to the reef for how much life it can bring is now gone as well. So just to give you an idea, we usually go off this big NOAA ship here. This is where we live for a month or two, depending on what's happening with the mission. And this is something that NOAA does with their marine debris program. I just happen to be lucky enough to be a part of it. And this is our little tiny boat that launches off of here, and we go find nets, fill it up, and then bring it back. So we connect this up. The ship takes off our big nets full of trash. This can weigh up to and over 2,000 pounds. And this is usually one day, maybe a little bit less. Sometimes we filled it up in like 2 hours. So that's about as much as we can take in these little inflatable Zodiac boats. They take this onto the ship, and then they'll pick up our little Zodiac boat, and then we'll be done depending on what time of day it is. So we find these nets all over the place. And one of the ways that we look for them underwater is we'll do this fun little thing called tow boarding. So basically the boat will just tow us along instead of swimming. It's a lot more efficient, but we do end up swimming most of the time. But we can tow and we look for nets. And then if we find a net, we let go of the board, put our hand up, and go get the net and bring it onto the boat. So it takes a lot of strength. A lot of these things can weigh up to a few thousand pounds. You can see how big some of them are. We found one that was at like 20 feet deep, and it was probably 40-foot long by 20-foot wide by like another 30 feet deep. So it was a huge conglomeration of nets, and we couldn't even get up most of it. So it's still sitting there in the ocean. We couldn't get it, couldn't cut it. It requires like huge machinery that you can't even get into these remote places. But you can see how many people sometimes it takes to pull up these nets, how large and massive they are. In this case, we have this many people up on top, and then we have a few of us down below pushing it into the boat, and it just takes a huge effort. Okay. More nets just to show you how much stuff. This is at Midway, and this is all stuff found only at Midway. So nowhere else in the world is this stuff being collected. It's from all over the world, but it's only stuff we found at Midway over like a few weeks of cleanup, if that. More stuff. So when we were talking about H-Power, one of the cool things that they can do is this nets to energy. Sorry, kind of hard to read on here. But they will basically take our nets. This is where they go. They chop them up from Schnitzer steel, and then they burn them and turn that into energy. So again, positives and negatives that are with that. So these beach cleanups, obviously you guys have probably taken part in beach cleanups here too. All of that is awesome. Never stop doing those kinds of things. We need people to be doing beach cleanups, but it's really like a Band-Aid, right? The problem's not going to get better if we keep doing beach cleanups. We have to stop the plastic pollution at the source. And this is, again, on Midway, and you can see how trashed it looked in that photo before, and then how little we have now. We put it into like little piles. The sad thing is you come back the next day after you clean the whole thing, and it looks almost the same. You just have that much trash washing up all the time. So we need to stop using these things. We need to stop using plastics. We need to stop using styrofoam. And that's a lot easier said than done, right? But it starts with little things. So instead of using plastic bags, use your reusable bags. Instead of getting takeout, either eat at home or bring your own reusable containers for takeout, which I know is really difficult in COVID times, although there has been research saying that they don't believe that that is an efficient way for the virus to transfer. But anytime I go and get tea, which again does not happen right now, but anytime I go get tea or coffee or anything like that, I always bring my own cup. Starbucks, any of these big chains, boba, they'll all refill it for you. Use a reusable water bottle. Try to cut down on your own consumption. Our first step is always refuse. And then if you can, reduce the amount of plastics you're using, reuse them if you can in any way. And last is recycle. Recycle is unfortunately one of the most difficult things. It doesn't really exist on this island, or even really in the world. There's very few plastics that ever get recycled, and even plastics that can be recycled usually can only be recycled one time. So please keep this in mind when you have consumer choices. You obviously do vote with your dollar, and you make big decisions based on what you buy. I'm a firm believer in that this doesn't all lie in your hands as a consumer. I think we do need to hold a lot of these companies accountable, and some of our top plastic producers are, I think Coke is one of the main ones, Pepsi. I just saw something with the top five. Unilever, um, shoot, I'm forgetting the other ones. Nestle, and I forget the fifth one, but those are some of our top five biggest plastic polluters. So it starts with asking them to reduce the amount of plastics that they're producing, and hopefully we can kind of not just have a band-aid of beach cleanups, but actually start at the source. Okay, last but not least, we'll talk about coastal erosion. This is something that's especially relevant on islands like ours, where we have tons of coast and we're seeing quite a bit of erosion. So beach erosion or coastal erosion, they're both pretty much the exact same thing, but it's actual removal of sand from a beach to a deeper water offshore or alongshore into inlets, tidal shoals, and bays. Why does it occur? It occurs for a few reasons, right? It could happen because of storms, high winds, if we have a tsunami, rising sea level. But the thing is that all of these things are worsened by climate change. Maybe a little bit less so with tsunamis, but it doesn't mean that these things aren't happening. They've always been happening, right? But the frequency and intensity that they are happening, especially in recent times, is happening more and more. It's more frequent and more intense. And that kind of thing is what makes scientists believe that climate change is affecting this as well as affecting things like erosion. So, how do we stop it? Well, one, the biggest thing, right, is that we try to slow climate change. So that's by making decisions both at a producer level and a consumer level. So what we choose to consume and hopefully who we choose to support as producers. But one of the biggest things is we have to reduce fossil fuel consumption, which leads to rising CO2 levels. There are other things that cause our carbon dioxide levels to rise that have to do with agriculture, slash and burn stuff, forestry. Let's see what else. There's also like there's about to be a really well, I don't know if it's really good, but it looks really interesting. A good documentary on Netflix about I think it's called Kiss the Ground. And it's about food waste and how that's increasing our carbon dioxide levels as well. So all of these things go into carbon dioxide levels. One of the biggest things is fossil fuel consumption. So we want to try to slow climate change and hopefully that'll slow coastal erosion, if not stop it completely. The other thing we can do, which is sort of a double-edged sword, is we can armor the shoreline, right? So you can put up seawalls, revetments, jetties, etc. But these are actually, you see them a lot. You see them all around this island. I see them all around the west coast of mainland as well, all over the world. Um, and when you see them, do they ever look really nice and pretty and new? No, right? And part of it's because they're in the ocean, but these actually have a really negative effect on our beaches because once the seawater reaches them, instead of the seawater just going up and down the coast like it normally would, what happens is it actually bounces off of that seawall, let's say, with more energy than a wave that would normally have if it just washed up on shore and back. So it actually ends up taking more of the beach away with it with all of that extra energy. And so we get more sand carried offshore, promotes more beach loss, and promotes more coastal erosion. Okay. So because of this coastal erosion, we see lots of different things that are on the beach that are in danger of falling into the ocean, that are getting major foundation cracks. Lot One of my favorite examples on this island is if you drive up the coast to Laie, on the windward side of the island, you can see how close the ocean is to the actual highway, right? And that highway is starting to have problems. It's closed a lot of the times if we do have really high wind, high surf, if we have a big storm. And that's happening all around the island, all around different islands as well. But it's one of the biggest effects that we're going to have for coastal erosion here. So we kind of have to start thinking ahead, putting stuff more inland, kind of anticipating these climate change effects that we'll have, like rising sea level and maybe more intense and frequent storms as well. So that's it for this lecture. Hopefully, I know it was a lot and there was a lot of different things, but hopefully you guys understand some of the cultural and scientific implications that go along with our service learning projects that we'll be doing, as well as marine debris and coastal erosion.